In the spring of 1954, a murder occurred in the small town of Ashford Falls, a farming community tucked deep in the American Midwest. At the time, Ashford Falls had fewer than 2,000 residents, one police station, one newspaper, and a reputation for being the kind of place where crime simply did not happen. But on the morning of April 17th, that belief collapsed. A local shop owner, Harold Whitman, was found dead behind his hardware store. He had been beaten severely, his skull fractured by a blunt object. There were no signs of robbery. The cash register inside the store was untouched. His wallet was still in his pocket. The back door showed no forced entry. By every definition, it was a homicide. And yet, today, no official police record of Harold Whitman's murder exists. No arrest report, no case number, no coroner's file, no archived investigation. It is as if the crime was quietly erased. At the time, Ashford Falls police assured residents that the death was under review. The local paper printed a single paragraph describing Whitman's passing as an incident. No follow-up article ever appeared. Within weeks, the story disappeared from public discussion entirely. Whitman's family moved away within a year. His store closed. The building was sold and repurposed. Life in Ashford Falls returned to normal, or at least it appeared to. Decades later, when historians and true crime researchers began digitizing mid-century police records, something unsettling surfaced. Neighboring towns had meticulous logs from the 1950s. Ashford Falls did not. Entire months of records were missing. April 1954 was blank. The absence raised a question that still has no answer. How does a murder vanish from the system designed to document it? And more importantly, who benefited from that disappearance? In a town where everyone knew each other, someone had to know the truth, and someone made sure it stayed buried. Harold Whitman was not the kind of man people expected to become the center of a mystery. At 46 years old, he had lived in Ashford Falls his entire life. He owned Whitman Hardware, a modest store that sold nails, tools, paint, and farm supplies. He was known as quiet, methodical, and reliable. He paid his taxes on time. He attended church on Sundays. He sponsored a local Little League team. By all outward appearances, Harold Whitman was invisible. But that invisibility may have been exactly what allowed his story to be erased. Whitman had no criminal history. He was not involved in politics. He was unmarried with no children. Most people described him as private, though several former residents later recalled that he asked unusually pointed questions about property ownership, zoning changes, and local business arrangements. In the months before his death, Whitman had made repeated visits to the county courthouse. Property ledgers show he had requested access to land transfer records dating back to the 1930s. At the time, Ashford Falls was undergoing quiet expansion. Several parcels of farmland were being consolidated and sold to a single development group based in Chicago. Whitman's name appears in handwritten notes beside at least 2 disputed transactions. One former clerk, interviewed decades later, recalled him saying, "Something about those deeds isn't right." Shortly before his death, Whitman told a neighbor he planned to close the store early for a while. He had begun setting aside boxes of documents in the back room, papers that were never recovered. After his body was discovered, those boxes were gone. Police reports, what little remains of them, do not list seized evidence. There is no inventory of the crime scene, no photographs, no witness statements. Only a single death certificate survives, and even that lists the cause of death as undetermined. For a man who lived quietly, Harold Whitman left behind an unusual number of unanswered questions, and someone made sure those questions were never officially asked. The morning of April 17, 1954, began like any other in Ashford Falls. At 6:42 a.m., a delivery driver noticed the rear door of Whitman Hardware slightly ajar. That detail alone was unusual. Harold Whitman was known for his routines. He locked up every night at precisely 6 p.m. The door was never left open. The driver stepped inside and called out. There was no response. Behind the store, in the narrow service alley shared with 2 adjacent buildings, He found Whitman's body lying face down on the concrete. There was dried blood beneath his head. His coat was still buttoned. His watch had stopped at 11:18 p.m. Police arrived within 20 minutes. At least, that is what surviving witness recollections suggest. There is no official dispatch log to confirm the timeline. Several residents later recalled seeing officers standing in the alley, speaking quietly, making no effort to cordon off the area. No crime scene tape was used. No photographers were present. One witness said the body was removed too quickly, before anyone outside the immediate area had even realized something had happened. The town coroner, Dr. Edwin Klein, arrived shortly after. He did not perform an autopsy. According to his handwritten notes, Whitman's injuries were consistent with accidental trauma. No explanation was offered for how such trauma occurred behind a locked store late at night. By noon, the alley had been hosed down. By evening, Whitman's death was no longer being discussed publicly. The local newspaper ran a single item the following day. It did not use the word murder. It referred to Whitman's death as an unexpected passing and asked for privacy on behalf of the family. Within 48 hours, the hardware store was sealed, not by police, but by the town council, citing structural concerns. Inside, the back room where Whitman had stored documents was empty. No suspects were named. No witnesses were interviewed formally, and the case was never assigned a number. Something had gone wrong that morning, but it wasn't just the death itself. It was the speed with which the town moved on. Next, we'll examine the police department's role and the records that should have existed but didn't. When historians later attempted to reconstruct the Whitman case, they encountered a problem that went far beyond missing details. There were no police records. Ashford Falls Police Department logs from 1954 were incomplete, but not absent. Arrests for drunk driving, petty theft, and domestic disputes were documented in careful handwriting. Yet the week of April 17th showed an unexplained gap. No incident report, no homicide entry, no supplemental notes. It was as though the department had skipped several days entirely. At the time, the police force consisted of 6 officers under Chief Walter Henson, a man who had held the position for nearly 2 decades. Henson was respected locally, but he also wore multiple hats. He served as town marshal, zoning advisor, and sat on the informal committee that reviewed land sales. That overlap mattered. When state archivists contacted Ashford Falls in the 1980s, requesting old case files, the department replied that several records had been lost during relocation. No explanation was offered for why only certain cases vanished. More troubling was the absence of state-level documentation. Violent deaths were required to be reported to the county sheriff and, in many cases, the state bureau. No such reports exist for Whitman. The county sheriff at the time, now long deceased, never mentioned the case in his annual summaries. The state crime index for 1,954 lists 0 homicides in Ashford Falls. Statistically, that alone is improbable. Former officers who were interviewed decades later claimed they were told the matter had been resolved. None could recall how. None remembered a suspect. Several said they had been ordered not to speak about it. One retired deputy offered a single sentence before ending the interview. Some things weren't meant to go on paper back then. The implication was clear. Whitman's death had not been forgotten by accident. It had been excluded. In the next chapter, we'll examine the land deals Whitman was investigating and why they may have threatened powerful interests far beyond the town itself. To understand why Harold Whitman's death disappeared, investigators had to look beyond the crime scene and into the land itself. In the early 1950s, Ashford Falls sat atop farmland that had been owned by the same families for generations. But in the years leading up to Whitman's death, that began to change. Property records show a sudden consolidation of parcels. Dozens of small plots sold off within months of each other. The buyer was a shell company called Midwest Development Holdings. On paper, it appeared legitimate. In practice, it had no public office, no listed employees, and no clear business plan. Yet it acquired nearly 40% of the land surrounding Ashford Falls between 1952 and 1954. Whitman had noticed discrepancies. Several deeds listed sellers who were either deceased or had moved away years earlier. Some signatures didn't match archived samples. In at least 2 cases, land was transferred without recorded compensation. Whitman had flagged these irregularities at the courthouse. He had asked for copies. He had taken notes. And then he was dead. Within 3 weeks of his death, Midwest Development Holdings finalized the largest transaction in town history, purchasing land directly adjacent to Whitman's store. The hardware building was included in the deal, sold by the estate through an expedited probate process. Whitman's surviving relatives were not present. Local officials approved the transfer unanimously. Construction never began. The land sat untouched for decades. Later research revealed that Midwest Development Holdings dissolved quietly in 1956. Its assets were transferred to a second company, which was later absorbed into a national real estate trust. No one could explain why so much land had been acquired and then abandoned. One former town council member, interviewed in the 1990s, said the deals were handled above our level. Above whose level? That question hung unanswered. In the weeks following Harold Whitman's death, several people in Ashford Falls noticed details that didn't align with the official silence. A few tried to speak about it. None of them was taken seriously. The delivery driver who found Whitman's body told friends he had seen tire marks in the alley that morning. Fresh, deep impressions that didn't belong to his truck. When he mentioned this to the police, he was told they were likely unrelated. No photographs were taken. Within days, the alley was resurfaced. A neighboring shop owner recalled hearing voices behind Whitman Hardware late the night before the body was discovered. He described at least 2 men arguing in low tones. When he later brought this up, he was advised by an officer to stop imagining things. Another resident, a teenage newspaper delivery boy, claimed he saw a dark sedan parked near the store around midnight. He wrote the license number down on a scrap of paper. The paper was later taken from him by an adult who said the police would handle it. The boy never saw it again. More telling was what happened afterwards. The delivery driver moved out of town within 6 months. The shop owner closed his business the following year. The paper boy enlisted in the military immediately after graduating and never returned. None of them gave formal statements. None were contacted again. Years later, when journalists attempted to locate these individuals, most had passed away. One declined to speak on record, saying only, "I learned early not to ask questions in Ashford Falls." Silence became the town's unspoken agreement. The lack of witnesses didn't mean none existed. It meant they were discouraged, subtly, effectively, and permanently. In the next chapter, we'll examine the role of the coroner and how a medical conclusion helped bury the truth. If the police records failed Harold Whitman, the medical review sealed his fate. Dr. Edwin Klein, the town coroner, was not a forensic specialist. In the 1950s, many small towns relied on general practitioners to serve as coroners, and Ashford Falls was no exception. Klein had known Whitman personally. They attended the same church. Their families had crossed paths for years. That familiarity mattered. Klein's official determination listed Whitman's cause of death as undetermined trauma. The wording was vague enough to avoid labeling the death a homicide. No autopsy was performed. No toxicology report was ordered. No second opinion was sought. At the time, state guidelines strongly recommended autopsies in cases involving head injuries and unexplained deaths. Klein ignored those guidelines. When later questioned, decades afterwards, Klein's surviving notes revealed something unsettling. In the margin of his ledger, next to Whitman's name, was a brief annotation. Pressure to resolve. No further explanation. Medical experts who reviewed the limited documentation concluded that Whitman's injuries were inconsistent with an accidental fall. The pattern of fractures suggested repeated blows. The angle of impact pointed to an assailant standing over him. Those conclusions were never recorded in 1954. By certifying the death without determining a manner, accident, homicide, or otherwise, Klein effectively removed the obligation for a criminal investigation. The case died administratively before it ever began. Shortly after Whitman's burial, Klein announced his retirement. He moved out of state and never practiced medicine again. Whether he acted out of fear, loyalty, or instruction remains unknown. What is clear is this: once the medical door closed, there was no legal mechanism left to reopen the case. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happened to Ashford Falls afterwards, and why the town itself began to change. After Harold Whitman's death, Ashford Falls did not erupt in outrage. It did something quieter and far more telling. It adapted. Within a year, long-standing businesses began to close. Families who had lived in town for generations sold their homes and left. Church attendance dropped. School enrollment declined. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible, but consistent. By the early 1960s, Ashford Falls had lost nearly a quarter of its population. Those who remained noticed a shift in behavior. People stopped lingering in public spaces. Conversations ended when unfamiliar faces approached. Questions about the past were met with polite deflections or outright discomfort. "You don't dig up old dirt," one longtime resident later said. "It never comes up clean." The land acquired by Midwest Development Holdings remained fenced and unused. Children were told not to play near it. Teenagers who trespassed reported being chased away by unidentified men, though no company security records existed. Town leadership also changed. Chief Walter Henson retired quietly. Several council members followed within a few years. Their replacements were younger, less connected to the town's history, and noticeably uninterested in revisiting old matters. Even the local newspaper altered its archives. Microfilm copies from the 1950s showed missing pages. Articles were truncated. References to Whitman's store appeared in advertisements, but never in newsprint after April 1954. It was as if the town had collectively agreed not to remember. Sociologists later referred to this phenomenon as institutional silence, a condition where communities suppress events that threaten their identity or stability. But that explanation only goes so far. Silence requires participation, and in Ashford Falls, participation seemed enforced. For nearly 30 years, Harold Whitman's death remained unexamined, until someone from outside Ashford Falls asked the wrong question. In 1983, a graduate student named Ellen Marsh arrived in town researching mid-century land consolidation for a university project. While reviewing county archives, she noticed irregularities tied to Ashford Falls. Entire parcels had changed hands without proper documentation. Names repeated, dates overlapped. One name kept resurfacing: Harold Whitman. Marsh requested police records. She was told they did not exist. She asked for newspaper archives. Several editions were missing. When she interviewed residents, many reacted with visible unease. A few declined outright. One warned her quietly to leave it alone. Marsh didn't. She submitted a formal request to the state for death records. That inquiry triggered something unexpected. Within days, she was contacted by a county official who insisted the matter was administratively closed. No reason was given. Then came the visit. Two men arrived at her motel room one evening. They identified themselves as representing property interests connected to her research. They advised her that her work could misrepresent the town's history and harm future development. Marsh returned to campus the next morning. Her thesis changed focus. Ashford Falls disappeared from it entirely. Years later, she admitted in a private interview that she had been frightened. Not threatened explicitly, but pressured in a way that felt unmistakable. "I realized," she said, "that someone still cared enough to keep it buried." That realization prompted others to re-examine. Journalists, archivists, and independent researchers began comparing notes. Patterns emerged. Ashford Falls wasn't the only town with missing records, but it was one of the most complete erasures. The question shifted. If the town was willing to protect a lie for decades, what exactly was being protected? By the early 2000s, advances in digital archiving and forensic mapping made it possible to revisit cases long thought unreachable. Ashford Falls was one of them. Researchers began cross-referencing land records, tax filings, and federal infrastructure plans. What emerged was a clearer picture of what Harold Whitman may have uncovered. Declassified documents revealed that, in the early 1950s, the federal government quietly surveyed portions of rural Midwest land for potential underground infrastructure projects, including energy transport corridors and defense-related storage facilities. These surveys were often conducted through intermediary development companies to avoid public attention. Midwest Development Holdings appeared in several of those documents. While no single file explicitly named Ashford Falls as a project site, the timing aligned. The land Whitman had flagged matched survey coordinates. The shell company's dissolution coincided with the cancellation or relocation of a classified project. More telling were the financial records. Forensic accountants traced Midwest Development Holdings funds through a network of banks that later surfaced in unrelated federal investigations. Several of those institutions had previously been cited for facilitating off-the-books land acquisitions during the Cold War era. Whitman, it seemed, had stumbled into something larger than local corruption. Digital enhancement of the few surviving photographs from Whitman hardware, recovered from private collections, revealed markings on crates in the back room. The labels were faint but recognizable. They matched inventory tags used by federal contractors in the early 1950s. That detail alone suggested Whitman may have been storing, or at least documenting, materials that were never meant to be publicly acknowledged. Still, none of this proved who killed him, but it established a motive. Whitman was not silenced because he was inconvenient. He was silenced because he was observant, and because he kept records. Despite renewed interest and mounting circumstantial evidence, Harold Whitman's case has never been officially reopened. In 2009, a coalition of historians and legal advocates formally petitioned the state to review unexplained deaths from the 1950s tied to missing records. Ashford Falls was included. The response came months later, brief, clinical, and final. The petition was denied. The justification cited insufficient primary documentation and lack of living witnesses. In other words, the very absence created by decades of suppression was used as the reason not to investigate further. Behind the scenes, resistance was stronger. Freedom of Information Act requests filed between 2010 and 2018 were partially fulfilled, but heavily redacted. Entire pages were withheld under exemptions tied to national security interests. Despite the events being more than half a century old, that language raised eyebrows. Legal scholars pointed out that most Cold War-era domestic projects had long been declassified. Yet something about Ashford Falls remained sensitive. When questioned, state officials deflected responsibility to federal agencies. Federal agencies referred inquiries back to the state. No one claimed ownership of the decision to keep the case closed. Meanwhile, the town itself continued to resist scrutiny. Attempts to install a historical marker acknowledging Whitman's death were voted down by the local council. Public forums addressing the town's past were sparsely attended and tightly moderated. Residents who spoke openly reported social backlash. One former council member, speaking anonymously, summarized it plainly. Reopening that case wouldn't just expose a murder. It would expose a system that relied on cooperation, silence, and time until recently had worked in its favor. In the end, the most disturbing part of Harold Whitman's story is not what we know, it's what we don't. There is no confession, no recovered weapon, no official acknowledgement that a crime even occurred. Only absences, the empty police logs, the missing newspaper pages, the land that was bought, fenced, and forgotten, and the man who noticed too much. Harold Whitman left behind no recorded last words, but he left traces, notes in courthouse margins, boxes that vanished overnight, questions that made people uncomfortable, questions that were never answered publicly. Today, Ashford Falls still exists, though much smaller than it once was. New families live there. New houses stand where Whitman Hardware once operated. The alley behind the old store has been paved over twice. Nothing marks the spot where he died. And yet, something lingers. In recent years, researchers noticed a final anomaly. A misfiled document in a federal archive, released quietly, without explanation, lists Ashford Falls as a restricted historical locality. No reason is given. No expiration date is attached. Why would a small farming town require restriction? No agency has answered that question. The file ends abruptly. The next page is missing, just like the records from April 1954. Some believe the truth was lost to time. Others believe it was deliberately compartmentalized, split across agencies, sealed behind classifications, waiting for the moment when no one involved would still be alive. Or perhaps the truth still exists, buried in an archive no one has asked for yet. Harold Whitman's murder didn't vanish because it was unsolvable. It vanished because someone decided it should. And as long as the official record remains empty, the question remains open. Was his death the end of a secret, or merely the last visible trace of something that was never meant to surface at all? The file is closed, but the space where the truth should be is still there, and it's waiting,